The drive to the warehouse lasted only 15 minutes, yet compared to the soul-crushing hour-long commute to my previous job, it felt almost like a stolen luxury, a fleeting glimpse of freedom in the monotony of working life. I pulled into the cracked asphalt of the employee parking lot outside the massive gray concrete monolith in Newark, New Jersey, 10 minutes early on that first morning, my heart beating with the heavy mixture of nervousness and reluctant hope that only a desperate man could feel. The warehouse itself was nothing remarkable to look at from the outside, just a sprawling industrial block with its blank walls, narrow windows like slits for eyes, and loading docks lining one side, but its unassuming appearance mattered little to me, for it was close to my apartment and it promised a paycheck larger than the one I had clawed from my last dead-end gig. And at that moment, stability meant more than beauty or pride. I grabbed the brown paper lunch bag from the passenger seat, locked my car, inhaled a deep breath of air that smelled faintly of oil and wet concrete, and made my way toward the employee entrance with the strange weight of 3 long months of unemployment pressing against my shoulders, 3 months of instant noodles, ignored calls from my landlord, and the suffocating fear of slipping beneath the surface of debt. So when this job had called back, I accepted without hesitation, without asking too many questions, without daring to demand details, because desperation dulls caution and turns necessity into obedience. The intercom buzzed under my touch, the metallic sound sharp in the silence, and the door released with a click, opening into a small, functional reception area where a man stood waiting for me. A man who appeared to be in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair cropped short, a trim build, and a smile etched across his face that reached his eyes but carried with it an experience too heavy to mask entirely. "Thomas Wright?" he asked in a warm tone as he extended his hand firmly, and I grasped it, answering with the eagerness of someone who knows the fragility of second chances. "I'm Jack Peterson, warehouse manager. Good to have you on." "Bored," he said, and I forced a grin. "Thanks for the opportunity. Please call me Tom," and he nodded approvingly. "Tom it is. Let's get your paperwork sorted, then I'll show you around." For half an hour, I sat in his office, filling out the endless forms while he explained the standard rhythms of the job: inventory counts, shipping schedules, safety protocols, break times, all the ordinary machinery of warehouse life. And yet, the way he spoke, calm, measured with the easy authority of someone who had said these things countless times, made it all flow naturally. Sometimes he would rake his fingers through his hair absent-mindedly, and I noticed that his desk, while organized, carried that slight messiness of a man too busy for perfection, but too disciplined for chaos. Eventually he asked, "Ready to see the place?" And I said yes, and the tour began, starting with the break room and locker area before opening onto the vast, echoing expanse of the warehouse floor, a space so immense it seemed to stretch into eternity with row upon row of towering metal shelving rising almost to the ceiling, concrete floors painted with yellow lines that sliced through the cavernous space like arteries, forklifts humming and beeping in the distance while workers moved with brisk precision between aisles, their steps rehearsed, their motions sharp, like actors who had rehearsed the same play 1,000 times. "We handle everything from electronics to furniture to seasonal goods," Jack explained, his voice echoing faintly against the high rafters as we walked. "Shipping is west, receiving east, specialized storage north." And as he spoke, I took in the heavy smell of cardboard, dust, and the faint tang of industrial cleaning agents that clung to the air, the sharp sound of our footsteps amplified in the cavernous void. Eventually, he gestured toward a section stacked high with boxed electronics. "This will be your main area. You'll handle inventory accuracy, order fulfillment, pulling items, sometimes assisting with loading, nothing outside your experience." And I nodded with cautious relief, the job sounding simple enough, straightforward, mechanical, something my hands and mind already knew. But when we returned toward his office, Jack's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. The relaxed warmth that had colored his words throughout the tour drained from his expression, replaced by something tighter, something guarded, his smile fading, his gaze sharpening with an unspoken gravity as though he was preparing to hand me not just responsibility, but a burden. "One more thing before you start," he said, lowering his voice slightly as he pulled open his desk drawer, extracting a single typed sheet of paper with bold letters at the top. "Warehouse rules." He placed it in my hands with deliberate seriousness, his eyes never leaving mine, and said, "These aren't suggestions, Tom. They're mandatory for every employee, no exceptions." Expecting tedious reminders about lifting techniques or forklift operation, I glanced at the list and felt a half-formed laugh bubble up in my throat before it froze there, strangled by the realization that Jack wasn't joking, that his face was dead serious. 1. If the lights go out, exit the building immediately. Do not use flashlights. 2. Never work alone in any section of the warehouse. 3. Ignore any voices or crying, even if they sound familiar. 4. All personnel must exit the warehouse floor during the 10:30 a.m. and 3:15 p.m. breaks, no exceptions. 5. If you get lost, follow the yellow floor lines only. Never take shortcuts. 6. Never enter the warehouse during a power outage, even if emergency lights are on. 7. If you see another employee hiding or acting strangely, do not acknowledge them. 8. Avoid looking directly at the tall figure in the shadows. If seen, look away and walk in the opposite direction. 9. Never remove warehouse items in your personal belongings. 10. If you hear your name after hours, do not respond. Leave immediately. I read the rules twice, waiting for some flicker of humor, some smirk, some sign of a prank, but Jack's eyes stayed hard, his tone steady, his hand tapping the paper like a warning bell. "This is unusual," I managed to say, keeping my voice neutral, but he only nodded. "I know how it sounds, but every rule exists for a reason. Some for efficiency, others for safety." His finger pressed against the page with quiet insistence. "I need your word. You'll follow them all. No exceptions." The words felt heavy, strange, absurd even. Yet the weight of my empty bank account, my unpaid rent, the gnawing hunger of unemployment silenced my doubts. The job paid $18 an hour with benefits after 90 days, and I couldn't afford another week of nothing. So I forced a steady voice and said, "Sure, I'll follow the rules," folding the paper into my pocket, and Jack studied me for a moment longer, his smile returning but hollow now, not reaching his eyes, as though he knew what it meant to give that promise. The morning dissolved into training videos and inventory walkthroughs, my mind almost managing to bury the rules until the first 10:30 break came, and then I saw it. How every single worker, without hesitation, without complaint, abandoned their stations at the exact minute and hurried toward the break room with a silent urgency disguised as routine. Jack appeared beside me, his tone firm. "Break time, everyone off the floor," and I followed, watching as employees lounged casually, scrolling phones, eating snacks, joking softly, yet none drifted near the door, none lingered near the threshold, all of them carrying the quiet tension of animals trained to avoid a predator. At 10:45 sharp, Jack called us back, and the work resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. The day flowed in motions of labor until, near the afternoon, while pulling an order, I caught sight of a woman crouching behind a pallet several aisles away, her brown hair tied in a ponytail, her movements sharp, nervous, like someone avoiding pursuit. Our eyes met briefly before she snapped hers away, and later during the mandatory 3:15 break, I found her again in the corner of the break room. Her name, Emily Turner, 8 months in, her voice hushed and her fingers restless against the table. And when I asked about the rules, her wide eyes darted around the room before she whispered, "Just follow them," like a plea, like a warning, before fleeing back to the floor as though she had already said too much. The rest of the day blurred into ordinary tasks until, returning from Jack's office near quitting time, the temperature around me dropped unnaturally cold, and aisle 14 seemed darker, deeper, Shadows thickening like ink poured across the floor, and in that darkness I thought I saw something. Something impossibly tall and thin, moving with a jagged rhythm that denied humanity. Something glimpsed from the corner of my eye, but absent. When I turned fully, and yet the echo of it lingered in my bones, a memory of movement where no one should have been, and in that moment Rule 8 screamed in my head, avoid looking directly at the tall figure in the shadows. My heart hammered as I punched out for the day, Jack's serious gaze replaying in my memory, Emily's whispered warning burning in my ears, and on the drive home I checked the rearview mirror again and again, unable to shake the sense that something impossibly tall was watching from just beyond the reach of the headlights. I had gone digging where I shouldn't have, tracing the warehouse's history through brittle records and faded archives until the truth began seeping through the cracks like smoke from an old fire. And the first thing that struck me was the date. The warehouse, the very building in which I worked, had been erected in 1978. Not ancient, but not new either, standing on ground already soaked in memory and ruin. And though at first this seemed like a trivial fact, something about it itched in my skull until I read further and saw what had occupied this land before. Eastwood Mental Institution, built. In 1924, shuttered only after a catastrophic blaze in 1976 that left dozens dead and the rest scattered like ash. One click brought me face to face with a grainy photograph, black and white, blurred by the decay of newsprint, showing a building whose very shape radiated cruelty. A brick hulk with barred windows like prison slits, its roofline jagged against the sky, and beneath it, the headline that froze me in place. Tragedy at Eastwood, 37. Dead in asylum fire. The article told a story I could almost smell. Flames ripping through the east wing on a cold October night, patients locked behind iron doors, screaming until the smoke consumed their voices. Staff scrambling. Firefighters breaking through too. Late, and by the time they had dragged the hoses into that furnace, it was finished. 37 human beings turned into silence and char. And yet, even as the words claimed accident, the whispers beneath suggested something darker. Rumors of neglect, whispers of cruelty dressed as treatment. Suggestions that in the bowels of the asylum, in the basement levels no visitor ever saw, experiments had been performed under the name of medicine, though the officials denied and buried every accusation beneath paperwork and dust. After the fire, the charred skeleton of Eastwood was bulldozed, its land left vacant and poisoned with memory for 2 years until some development company swept in, built a warehouse over the scorched ground, and sold it as if concrete and shelves could erase what had happened there. But the past does not burn so easily, and as my search deepened, I stumbled on something that hollowed my gut. The disappearances, the long chain of vanishings that stretched like a shadow across 40 years. At least 6 employees whose names surfaced only in police reports and half-forgotten local articles. People who clocked in one day and never came out again. And though the official explanations painted them as quitters, runaways, drifters abandoning their lives, their families screamed otherwise, insisted they had been stolen, erased, pulled into some void that no one wanted to name. The name Maria Vasquez surfaced first, a woman who had worked only 3 months before vanishing in 2011. Her car still sitting patiently in the employee lot like a loyal dog waiting for its owner. But Maria never returned. No trace ever surfaced. Then Derek Chen, 2004, a man who dissolved into paranoia in the weeks before his end, muttering about voices in the warehouse, hearing things in the dark, until one day he quit without a word, left behind everything he owned, and disappeared. From the map entirely. Each article I read stacked unease upon unease until the shape of it was undeniable. The rules we lived under, the strange list recited to every employee, were not quirky safety guidelines but barricades against something real, something inherited. From Eastwood's ashes, something that hunted within these walls. I closed my laptop that night with hands trembling, sleep fractured by dreams where tall shadows moved endlessly through aisles that stretched further than geometry allowed. whispering my name in tones that shifted like broken glass. And when the gray dawn broke with drizzle spattering the windows, I dragged myself to the warehouse carrying dread like a second skin. And as I walked inside, I saw it differently, with new awareness. The way employees unconsciously steered clear of certain corners. The way laughter died in some hallways. The way silence swallowed whole sections of floor at specific times, like invisible predators crouched just beyond sight. Lunchtime brought me to the break room where Emily sat alone, pale, worn, the dark crescents beneath her eyes like bruises left by something unseen, and though her presence radiated, "Don't bother me," I approached anyway, carrying my sandwich. As excuse, asking lightly if I could join, and she answered with a weary shrug. "Free country." Her voice clipped, brittle, her fork moving through her salad like it was her last meal, and when I pressed with small questions, how long she'd worked here, whether she liked it, her answers were automatic, detached. 8 months, pays the bills, like a machine that had said the same words too many times. So I leaned closer, dropped my voice, and asked the forbidden thing. About the rules, about the voices, about the figures, and in that instant her entire posture shifted, her fork frozen midair before she set it down slowly, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of prey, making sure the predator hadn't noticed, and she whispered, "Not here. Meet me at the loading dock," her lips barely moving. We ate the rest in silence, 2 prisoners sharing a cell with invisible bars, and when the break ended, I followed the current of workers only to slip aside, finding Emily already waiting in the corner shadows of the dock, her arms wrapped across, her chest like armor, and her words cut sharp. "You shouldn't be asking questions. Not if you want to keep working here." I told her I'd already seen things, the tall figure in aisle 12, her hiding when she thought no one noticed, and her face hardened with something between pity and fear. "Look, we all see different things. That's how it works. What I see might not be what you see. But the rules, they're not for show. They're about whatever's in this building." She hesitated, then added with a glance down at the floor, "People who break the rules don't last long." Her voice cracked when she named names. Carlos, shipping clerk, stayed late, heard his name called from the storage area, answered, and by morning only his ID badge lay near the loading dock, his car abandoned in the lot for 3 days until someone else drove it away, his life scrubbed into absence. Then Diane, who had gone to the restroom during the 10:30 break and never come out, her purse still resting on the sink as if she had stepped out of reality mid-breath, security finding only an empty room and silence thick as oil. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were survival tactics, and the times of the breaks, she confessed, were the only hours employees could breathe unharassed, as if those entities grew hungriest at those minutes. I asked why, but she shook her head, glancing at her watch, whispering that the rules kept them alive, nothing more, and as we returned to our post, she gripped my arm. Her words burned into me. "Whatever you found out this weekend, whatever you're planning, be careful. Just follow the rules. You're starting an inventory," Jack said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and expectation as though he were not simply assigning a role but delivering a sentence. His eyes slid briefly toward Michael, the new hire, a man, with the careless grin and cocky posture of someone who had not yet learned to respect the air of dread that clung to this building, a man who still thought this was just another job. "Shipping department," Jack added, as though tying the thread of inevitability around Michael's neck. Then his gaze cut toward me. "I thought you could show him around after orientation. Since you're still relatively new yourself, the tour route should be fresh in your mind." I nodded because refusal wasn't an option. Not here, not with Jack watching, though every part of me recoiled at the idea of being responsible for someone like Michael, someone who radiated arrogance instead of caution, someone who would laugh at the rules that had become lifelines for the rest of us. "Perfect," Jack said, his smile thin and unreadable. "Let's get the paperwork started then. Tom, we'll meet you in the break room in about 30 minutes. His tone carried finality, and the two of them turned down the hall toward Jack's office. I drifted away toward my locker, the dull clang of my boots echoing against concrete, as if the building itself resented my presence. Emily was already at her locker, stacking her neatly folded lunch containers, her movements precise, almost ritualistic, as though she believed that even the smallest habits might protect her from the chaos that lurked between these walls. "New guy starting today," I muttered, my voice a low current of unease. She glanced down the hallway where Jack and Michael had disappeared into shadow. Her eyes narrowed. "Hope he's a rule follower. He seems pretty casual, confident. Type." She shut her locker with a quiet click that carried more finality than a slammed door. Those are the ones who don't last. I wanted to tell her right then about Cooper's journal, the brittle pages I'd flipped through under the cold glow of my phone light, the rules scribbled in a hand that shook with decades of fear, rules far beyond the 10 the company forced us to memorize, rules that made the hair rise on the back of my neck even as I read them. But other employees were trickling in now, boots scuffing, conversations low and guarded, and the walls had ears. Instead, I forced out, "Can we talk later? I found something yesterday." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the others, then back to me, measuring the weight of the moment. Loading dock, lunch break. 30 minutes later, I stood in the break room with Jack and Michael. The air reeked faintly of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, a mix that never left this place, as though the warehouse exhaled its own brand of poison. Jack handed me a clipboard heavy with orientation papers, a map of the warehouse floor clipped to the back. "I have a supplier meeting this morning," he explained, every word clipped, every syllable sharpened. "Can you handle showing Mike around? Make sure you cover all the standard areas, especially the emergency exits and break schedule." I nodded, though the weight of it pressed down like chains. "Sure," I said, the word tasting like ash. Jack's eyes flicked toward Michael. "Great. Mike, Tom will get you up to speed. Remember those rules we discussed?" His gaze lingered, too long, heavy, as though he were daring Michael to dismiss them. Then Jack left, the sound of his boots receding like the toll of a warning bell. As soon as the door shut, Michael snorted. "Man, is he always so intense about the special rules?" His tone was laced with mockery, his smile broad, teeth flashing in the fluorescent light. My stomach sank. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. He pulled a crumpled sheet from his pocket. The warehouse rules, company issued, 10 commandments scrawled on cheap paper, and waved it like a prop in some cruel comedy. This whole haunted house routine. Never look at the tall figure in shadows. Don't respond if you hear your name after hours. He laughed, a sound too loud, too bright for this place. "Your boss has a weird sense of humor." I froze, mid-step, the air tightening around me. "Those rules aren't a joke," I said quietly, every word heavy with the memory of the shadows I'd seen, the screams I'd heard. Michael rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. I've worked in 3 different warehouses. They all have their stupid hazing rituals for the new guys. Some places make you search for a left-handed wrench or striped paint. Here, they try to convince you the place is haunted." He tucked the paper away, smirking. "It's not hazing," I said, my voice low but edged with desperation. "People have disappeared here." He gave a mock shiver. "Right, eaten by the boogeyman in aisle 7. What's next on the tour? The chair that spins by itself? The ghost in the bathroom?" I wanted to grab him, to slam him against the wall and force him to understand the weight of what he was dismissing, but instead, I bit it back, swallowing anger and fear alike. "Let me show you the shipping department," I muttered, turning away. The morning dragged like a chain as I led him through the vast maze of shelves and forklifts, explaining exits, break times, procedures. Over and over, I tried to tell him why the rules mattered, why they were not suggestions but boundaries, written in blood and loss, but every time he only laughed, brushing me off. When I told him about the break times, how mandatory they were, he scoffed. So, we all have to hide in the break room because the ghost clock strikes 10:30? He shook his head, grinning. No warehouse is this strict about break times. It's ridiculous. My voice grew sharp. It's not about being strict, it's about safety. His smirk widened. Safety from what? Bad feng shui? He checked his watch with exaggerated boredom. It's almost break time now. Guess we better run before the boogeyman gets us. The 10:30 alarm rang, sharp and metallic, vibrating through the warehouse like a war drum. All around us, employees dropped what they were doing mid-task and streamed toward the break room. Michael watched them with a smirk, shaking his head. Wow, they've really got everyone buying into this. Impressive commitment to the bit. He followed anyway, but during the 15 minutes inside, he spent the entire time mocking the rules, asking if anyone had seen tall shadow men, if ghosts haunted the vending machines, if this place had a resident bathroom phantom. Most ignored. Him, their faces hard, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one laughed, not even once. He didn't notice. He didn't care. When the break ended, I left him with Louise from shipping, letting her train him on procedures. I needed space, distance from his constant ridicule, from the gnawing dread in my stomach that told me his arrogance would end in blood. At lunch, I slipped to the loading dock where Emily was waiting, her arms folded tight across her chest. I pulled out my phone, showed her the photographs of Cooper's journal entries, the frantic handwriting, the endless additions to the rules. I found a hidden office yesterday, I explained, my voice hushed. This journal belonged to a security guard who worked here in the 80s and 90s. He documented everything, the incidents, the disappearances, and he had his own rules. Beyond the 10, at least 30 more. Emily scrolled through the photos, her face draining of color with every swipe. Jesus, she whispered. Her hand trembled as she gave the phone back. Rules about mirrors, about certain storage rooms, about staying in one place too long during night shifts, I added. She hugged herself against the warm air. I should have quit months ago, after what happened to Carlos. Her voice broke. Why didn't you? She stared at me, haunted. I tried twice. First time my car wouldn't start for 3 days straight. Second time, my mother had a stroke the morning I was going to hand in my notice. It was like something didn't want me to leave. Her words slithered under my skin. Cooper's journal mentioned the same thing. Employees who tried to quit had accidents until they came back. Her gaze flicked up to me, wide, frightened. What about the new guy? The one you were showing around this morning? Michael, he thinks the rules are a joke. Her head shook slowly, sorrowfully. That's how it starts. They laugh. They break a rule. They disappear. Then we're told they quit without notice. Jack continued. He has decided the position wasn't suitable for him and will not be returning. And the words rolled off his tongue with that practiced corporate detachment that made my stomach tighten, because even as he said them, he glanced across the room, and his eyes locked on mine. And in that gaze, the truth was louder than the lie. This is what happens when the rules are broken. This is what happens when you forget that in this place the guidelines are more than policy. They are survival, and everyone else in the room looked down at the table or shuffled their papers as if they hadn't just heard Michael scream tearing through the walls the night before, as if they hadn't noticed the absence at his station this morning, as if pretending meant safety. Because denial is easier than facing the fact that something inhuman lives with us in the warehouse, something that decides who stays and who vanishes. And Jack wrapped up the meeting with that smooth line about safety being our primary concern and the rules being there for our protection, and then dismissed everyone as though we'd been discussing a quarterly report instead of a man's disappearance. And I watched my co-workers file out in silence, their footsteps heavy, their lips pressed into thin lines, none of them daring to mention the blood-curdling sound we all knew had been Michael's final cry. None of them daring to admit that a fellow worker had been dragged away by things no one dares to describe, and when the last of them slipped out the door, I stayed behind, heart pounding, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects, and waited until I was alone with Jack. And then I said flatly, he didn't quit. And Jack, calm as ever, straightened the stack of papers on the conference table like he was rearranging his own thoughts. And he said, "Tom, I understand this is difficult to process, but the rules exist for a reason." And I snapped back, he was taken by those things. I saw it happen. But Jack only met my stare with a measured look, speaking carefully as though to a child or to someone hysterical, saying what you saw was a new employee who chose not to follow clearly stated protocols, and the consequences of that choice are unfortunate but not unexpected. And his words slithered into me like poison, because even as he said them, we both knew it was a lie. We both knew Michael Bailey had not chosen to vanish, he had been claimed, and I asked bitterly, "And now what? We just pretend he never existed? File a report saying he quit?" And Jack finally let his expression soften just slightly, enough to give the impression of sympathy, though I could see the exhaustion buried in his eyes, and he asked, "What would you have me do, Tom? Tell everyone the truth. Tell them that beings we cannot comprehend stalk the aisles of our warehouse and take people who misstep. Would that help? Would that keep anyone safe?" And I had no answer, because he was right in a way. Truth would not protect us. Truth would only unravel the fragile structure of denial that kept the rest of the employees sane enough to keep showing up each day. And finally, Jack dismissed me gently. "Go home, Tom. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a normal day just like always." And the way he said normal made my skin crawl, because normal here meant pretending that monsters weren't just out of sight, that the rules weren't etched in blood, that every step wasn't already weighted with fear. And on my way out, instead of heading straight to the door, I detoured through the aisle where Michael had last stood, and though the clipboard that had been in his hand was gone, I noticed under the cruel glare of the lights a faint discoloration on the concrete, a small dark stain like a shadow that wouldn't wash away, and when I crouched closer, I saw it for what it was. Blood. Only a few drops, but enough to confirm what I already knew. Enough to tell me Michael had not walked away from this job of his own free will. Enough to prove that beneath the corporate veneer was something ancient and merciless. And as I stood, up again, throat tight, I realized Jack was watching me from the far end of the aisle, silent and unreadable. And he said nothing, because he didn't need to, because in that gaze we both acknowledged the truth. We both knew Michael Bailey had been taken, and we both knew the rules would be enforced not by management, but by whatever controlled this warehouse, by whatever lurked in the shadows, just beyond human sight. And after what happened to Michael, I could not just go back to normal. I could not erase from my mind the look on his face at the last moment, the dawning horror as realization took hold, the sheer terror as the truth revealed itself and swallowed him whole. And though the official story would always say he quit, that he left voluntarily, I knew better. And so did everyone else, though their lips would never shape the words, and the silence pressed on me until I felt I would choke. So I knew I needed answers, not more platitudes, not more mysteries. And the very next morning I called in sick, my voice shaking on the phone, though Jack accepted the excuse too easily, his tone carrying an edge that told me he knew I wasn't ill, that he knew I was digging, that perhaps he even wanted me to dig. And I spent the day poring over the scanned photographs of Raymond Cooper's journal, flipping through the cramped handwriting again and again until one name began to surface, repeatedly from the chaos. Sarah Mitchell, a logistics coordinator in the late 80s and early 90s, described by Cooper as one of the only employees who grasped the reality of what we faced, and most importantly, she had survived. She had not been claimed, she had left, and she was one of the very rare few who escaped. And in Cooper's final entry, he noted that she quit after the East Wing incident and managed to walk away. And if she was still alive, I had to find her, because she might hold the answers no one else dared to speak. And so I searched. cross-referencing. The scraps Cooper left with social media and public records until at last I traced her to Hoboken, just 20 minutes from the warehouse, where records showed she had bought a modest house in 1992. A year after leaving, and though I considered calling, instinct told me she would hang up the moment I said the word warehouse. So instead I drove there after dinner. The streets quiet, the houses small and neat, her home well kept with hedges and potted plants. And I sat outside in my car rehearsing impossible introductions. How do you tell a stranger you know the place she worked was built on suffering? That you need her to tell you about the inhuman rules that you too have seen, the tall figures and heard the cries, but eventually I forced myself to the porch and rang the bell, and after a long pause the door cracked open against a security chain, revealing a woman with graying bobbed hair, eyes sharp with suspicion, and she asked if she could help me, and I said, "Sarah Mitchell." And when she asked who I was, I told her my name and where I worked and that I had found her name in Raymond Cooper's journal. And I watched the color drain from her face like a candle snuffed out. And for a heartbeat I thought she would slam the door, but instead she whispered, "You've read it?" And I said yes, parts of it. I found it in a hidden office, and she studied me long and hard before asking what section I worked in. And when I said inventory, East Wing mostly, she asked in a low voice, "Have you seen them?" And I didn't need to ask what she meant. I simply said yes, the tall figures, and I was there when they took someone, and her face tightened and she shut the door. And I thought that was the end, that she wanted nothing more to do with me. But then I heard the chain slide and the door opened fully and she said, "Not here. Meet me at the diner down the street in 20 minutes," and slammed it shut again before I could respond. And so I drove to the diner, nearly empty, taking a booth at the back where shadows pooled, and Sarah arrived 15 minutes later, scanning the room like a hunted animal before sitting across from me, ordering coffee with a trembling hand, and she said she never thought she'd hear Cooper's name again. And when I asked if she had known him, she said he had been the only one who listened, the only one who didn't dismiss her as paranoid even after Carlos disappeared. And I sat up at that name because Emily had once mentioned someone called Carlos too. And Sarah gave a humorless smile and said there had been many Carloses over the years because the warehouse followed patterns. And then she leaned closer, her voice dropping, and asked me why I was here, what I wanted, and I told her the truth. I wanted answers about the warehouse, about Michael Bailey, about the rules that bound us to silence and ignorance, and she fixed me with a piercing stare and said if she told me what she knew, then I must promise to quit, to walk away without notice, to cut ties forever. And I hesitated because I needed this job. But then Michael's scream ripped through my memory and I knew what awaited me if I stayed. So I promised, and only then did she begin to talk, to unravel the history buried beneath the concrete floor. He began with the foundation, the first layer of concrete poured over swamp soil in 1965, when the city approved construction far too hastily, ignoring reports from surveyors who had warned that the land was unstable, strange, littered with sinkholes. But the company had money and influence, and so the warehouse rose, and Sarah's voice trembled as she said it was never truly a warehouse, not in the way most people imagined, because the blueprints did not match what was built, because additions were made without permits, corridors sealed and then reopened, rooms appearing that no one remembered until suddenly they were part of the floor plan. And she said she had seen it with her own eyes, a hallway that stretched farther on Friday than it had on Thursday, a loading dock door that opened not onto asphalt but into darkness that smelled of iron and rot. And she leaned close to me across the booth as the waitress topped up our coffee, whispering, "It moves when you're not looking." And my throat went dry because I had seen it too, though I had never dared name it, that subtle shifting of space. Like the building itself was alive and rearranging itself to suit some purpose beyond human comprehension. And when I asked her what the rules were meant to protect us from, she said flatly, "From them, the tall ones, the ones who walk the aisles at night, the ones who enforce the bargain." And I asked her what bargain, and she laughed bitterly. Not a kind of humor, but a release of fear, and said the company made a deal decades ago, maybe even before it was built, No one knows who signed or what was promised, but the gist is simple. The warehouse thrives, the business prospers, but the building must feed, and it feeds on us. And the rules are the only way to minimize the cost, to ensure only a few are taken instead of all. And I felt my blood turn cold because this was no longer rumor or paranoia. This was testimony from a survivor, someone who had walked away with her mind intact, though just barely. And she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, trembling as she slid it across the table. And I unfolded it with shaking fingers to see a list written in neat block letters. The rules, though not the sanitized version we had taped to the break room wall, not the vague suggestions about safety protocols, but the real ones, scrawled with specificity and menace. Do not whistle after 10 p.m. Never step into aisle 12 after midnight. If you hear your name spoken from behind you, do not turn around. If the lights flicker 3 times, do not move until they steady. And the list went on and on. Rules I had never heard, rules that implied horrors beyond the ones I had seen, and at the bottom in Sarah's handwriting was one final warning. If you are ever chosen, nothing can save you. And I looked up at her, my hands shaking, and she said she had watched Carlos vanish when he forgot to follow one, and Cooper had written his name too, because he had cataloged every disappearance, every misstep, every punishment, until finally he vanished himself. And I whispered, "Then why did they let you go?" And she said softly, "Because I followed every rule. Because I listened when Cooper told me never to push, never to ask too many questions, and because when the East Wing collapsed and took 5 people, with it, I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just walked calmly to the exit like the rules said, and for some reason, they let me go." And her eyes welled with tears as she said she sometimes wondered if that was worse, if surviving was worse than being taken, because every night she still dreamed of the tall figures, of the faces of the people who didn't make it, of the way the warehouse seemed to breathe like a living thing. And then she grabbed my hand across the table, her grip fierce, her nails digging into my skin, and she said, "Tom, you must leave. Don't go back, because once you've seen them, they notice you. They mark you, and sooner or later, you'll make a mistake." And I wanted to promise her then and there that I would quit. But even as the words rose in my throat, something inside me resisted. Something dark and obsessive. Because beneath the terror was a gnawing hunger to understand, to peel back the veil and see the truth of what controlled the warehouse. And Sarah must have seen that hesitation in my eyes because her face crumpled with despair, and she shoved back from the booth, muttering, "Then you're already lost." And she left without finishing her coffee, the bell above the diner door jingling as she disappeared into the night, leaving me with the list of rules burning in my hands like a curse. And I sat there for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the paper, feeling the words etch themselves into my brain, until finally I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket and drove home through streets that seemed darker than usual, every shadow along the road reminding me of the tall figures, every flicker of the street lamps making me freeze until the light steadied. And when I got home, I locked every door and window. But even in the silence of my apartment, I felt watched, as though the act of speaking Sarah's name aloud had drawn their attention. And that night I dreamed of Michael again, his mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear, his body dragged backwards into the dark by impossibly long arms, and I woke with my throat raw as if I'd been screaming with him, the sound still echoing in my head. And when I staggered to the bathroom, I found the paper still in my pocket, but now damp with sweat, the ink smudged, and I wondered if it was already too late for me, if simply knowing too much had sealed my fate. But still, I returned to work the next day, unable to stay away, the warehouse pulling at me like gravity. And as I walked through the East Wing, I swore the aisles were longer, the shelves higher, the shadows thicker. And I found Jack in his office, calm as always, sipping coffee. And when he saw me, he said simply, "You found her, didn't you?" And the way he said it froze me, because it was not a question, but a statement. And I demanded to know how he knew. And he smiled faintly, almost with pity, and said, "We always know, Tom, because no one leaves once they've seen the truth." And he leaned forward, voice dropping, and said, "I told you before, the rules exist for a reason, and now you understand why, don't you?" And I wanted to scream, to demand he explain everything. But then the lights flickered 3 times and Jack froze, holding up a hand, whispering, "Don't move." And we both sat motionless in silence as the overhead bulbs buzzed and dimmed and brightened again. And when they steadied, Jack exhaled slowly and lowered his hand. And only then did I realize my nails had cut crescents into my palms from how tightly I had clenched my fists, and I whispered, "What happens if you move?" And Jack's face went pale, and he said, "You don't want to know." And I believed him, because in that moment something vast and unseen had passed over us, brushing against the fabric of reality like a predator circling prey. And though it had moved on, I knew it had noticed me. I knew it had marked me. And that night when I tried to sleep, I heard my name whispered softly in the darkness of my bedroom, and I lay frozen, my body stiff with terror, remembering Sarah's warning. If you hear your name spoken from behind you, do not turn around. And so I didn't. I stayed rigid, staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face until dawn finally broke and the whispering stopped. And when I stumbled to the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized my own reflection, pale and hollow-eyed. And in that moment, I understood what Sarah had meant when she said, "Once you've seen them, they notice you." And I realized I was already entangled in their gaze, and perhaps I always had been. Yet even knowing I was entangled did not stop me from returning, because the warehouse had become more than just a place of employment. It had become an obsession, a labyrinth that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, promising answers I could never quite reach. And so the next night I found myself driving back long after my shift had ended, parking in the far lot where the floodlights barely reached, the asphalt cracked and buckling like an old scar. And the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the building pressing against me, a silent pulse that seemed to emanate from its foundations. And I told myself I was only here to look, to reassure myself that Sarah was wrong. But deep down, I knew I was lying. I wanted the truth, even if it destroyed me. And as I slipped through the side door with my badge, the warehouse greeted me with a stillness that felt deliberate, as though it were holding its breath, waiting, and the aisles stretched into shadow, shelves towering like cathedral spires, the air heavy with dust and something metallic that coated the back of my throat, and I moved slowly, every sound amplified, the squeak of my shoes, the distant hum of a failing light, the low groan of steel shifting overhead. And then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of papers rustling, though there was no breeze, and I followed it deeper until I found myself standing before the locked door that Sarah had warned me about, the one Cooper had written of in his journal. And to my shock, it stood slightly ajar, the padlock dangling uselessly as if melted, and the air that seeped through the crack was cold, impossibly cold, like the breath of a crypt, and against every instinct screaming in my mind, I pushed the door open and descended the narrow staircase into the hidden office, the walls sweating with damp, the smell of mold and copper. The room unfolded before me like a mausoleum of forgotten lives, shelves bowing under the weight of cardboard boxes and old file binders swollen with moisture, papers strewn across a warped wooden desk as though abandoned mid-sentence, and at the center of it all lay a single journal, its leather cover darkened with age, the word Cooper barely visible in flaking gold letters, and the moment my fingers brushed it, I felt a vibration like a heartbeat pulse through the leather, as though the book itself were alive, and when I opened it, the pages screamed silently with cramped handwriting, frantic scrawls, and underlined warnings, accounts of nights when the tall figures roamed unchecked, of rules broken and bodies never found, and again, one word emerged from the chaos. Feeding, always capitalized, always repeated, sometimes written until the ink tore through the page, and I read about Michael, his disappearance catalogued coldly in Cooper's words, how he had failed to look away in time, how the figures had twisted around him like smoke and pulled him through the shelves, and I read of Carlos, taken after he whistled past midnight, and dozens more, names scratched out, initials only, as though even writing them risked drawing. Their attention and Cooper's descent into madness unfolded line by line, his paranoia mounting, his belief that the warehouse itself was not merely a vessel for the entities, but part of them, a living structure with tendrils rooted deep into the soil, feeding on time, on memory, on flesh. And the deeper I read, the more the words seemed to shift on the page. Letters bending, shapes curling into patterns that weren't English, weren't human, and I blinked hard, my head pounding. But when I looked again, the words had rearranged into sentences directed at me. Sentences that shouldn't have existed. Tom, it read, Tom, you shouldn't be here, Tom. They're watching you now. And the breath fled my lungs because I had never told anyone where I was going, never spoken aloud my intentions, yet here my name was, etched into a book decades old, and I dropped it with a gasp, the journal thudding onto the damp floor, and the sound reverberated far too loudly, echoing like a gunshot through the small office. And then I heard it, the shuffle of something heavy moving in the corridor above, a rhythm too deliberate to be pipes, too heavy to be rats, and the light bulb overhead flickered once, twice, 3 times, and I remembered Jack's hand raised in warning, "Don't move." And so I froze, crouched on the slimy floor, heart slamming so hard I thought it would burst, and in that frozen silence something vast passed down the stairwell, a shadow that was not cast by any physical form, but pressed against the walls as though the very air had taken shape, and I felt it pause, felt its attention turn toward me, a weight like a hand pressing down on the back of my skull, and for an eternity I remained unmoving, sweat dripping into my eyes, until the bulb steadied again and the pressure lifted, but not completely. It lingered, like a smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left the room, and I knew, with a clarity that hollowed me out, that I had been marked, truly marked this time, and no rule could erase that mark. And as I stumbled up the stairs, gasping for air, clutching the railing like a drowning man, I thought I saw movement at the far end of the corridor. A figure too tall, its head brushing the ceiling, its arms impossibly long, and though its face was nothing but blur and shadow, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was smiling. Straight, arms out, head tilted up. Around him, dozens of candles made a circle of light. Jack was speaking in some language I didn't know, his voice going up and down in a rhythm that hurt my ears. The room had this feeling like right before lightning hits. The patterns on the floor gave off a faint glow, pulsing with Jack's words. Along the walls, shadows were moving on their own, stretching and shrinking like they were alive and testing how far they could go. I should have left right away, but I just stood there frozen, watching Jack do whatever ritual this was. Then he suddenly stopped talking and turned to look at me. I thought he'd be mad that I was there, but his face showed something completely different. Relief. "Tom," he said, "I've been waiting for someone like you who can see them. I was just looking for you." I stammered. "I didn't mean to." "You found the door because you were meant to." Jack stepped out of the innermost circle, careful not to disturb the pattern of candles. The shadows on the walls reacted to his movement, stretching toward him before receding. "The warehouse led you here." "The warehouse led me." "What does that mean?" "This building has awareness, Tom. Not consciousness as we understand it, but something similar. It knows who enters its walls. It tests them. It shows itself to those who can potentially serve as keepers." I backed toward the stairs. "I came to quit, Jack. I know what this place really is. I know about Eastwood, about the experiments, about the entities." Jack nodded slowly. "Sarah Mitchell, you found her. She told me everything." "Not everything. She couldn't have." Jack looked tired with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor to his skin that hadn't been there the day before. "She never completed her training. She never became a keeper. There are things only we can know. I'm not interested in knowing more. I promised Sarah I'd quit, and that's what I'm doing." "You can't." Jack's voice was gentle but firm. "Not now. The containment is getting weaker. I can't hold them back alone anymore." He gestured to the ritual space behind him. "This used to be enough, but not anymore. They're growing stronger, more aware. I need a successor. Find someone else. Don't you understand? There is no one else. Not here, not now." Jack took a step toward me. "Why do you think I hired you, Tom? Your resume wasn't exceptional. Your interview was average at best, but I sensed something in you. The potential, the ability to perceive what others can't." I remembered my first day, how Jack's mood had changed when he gave me the rules, how he'd looked at my face, checking for a reaction. "You knew from the beginning," I suspected. "Then you saw the tall man in aisle 12, and I was certain." Jack looked over his shoulder at the chalk circles. "The entities are becoming more aggressive. You saw what happened to Michael. That was just the beginning." "What happens if the containment fails completely?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Chaos, death. The entities don't understand our world or its rules. They experience time and space differently. Their mere presence warps reality around them." Jack closed his eyes briefly. "I've been keeper for 15 years. Diana before me lasted 12. The role demands sacrifice, but it's necessary." A thought occurred to me. If these entities are so dangerous, why not just demolish the building? Start over somewhere else? "You think that wasn't considered?" Jack shook his head. "After the fire before the warehouse was built, they tried to cleanse the site. Religious leaders, paranormal researchers, even government specialists. Nothing worked. The entities were bound to this location so deeply that destroying the physical structure would only release them without the containment measures we've established." One of the shadows along the wall stretched toward us, looking like a tall, thin human with impossibly long arms. Jack looked at it, muttered something under his breath, and the shadow moved back. "The boundaries are weakening by the day," he said. "I need someone to help me maintain them. Someone who will eventually take my place when I can no longer serve." Jack's eyes met mine. "I need you, Tom. We need you." I thought about Sarah's warning, about my promise to her, about the normal life I'd have if I walked away now. But I also thought about what might happen if the creatures escaped, if the things that took Michael were free to move beyond these walls. "I just stock inventory," I said weakly. "I'm not equipped for this." "Neither was I when Diana chose me," Jack replied. "The role changes you, prepares you." He held out his hand. "I'm not asking you to decide this minute, just to stay, to learn, to understand what's at stake." The shadows on the walls moved again, looking like faces for a few seconds. Weird, pained expressions that quickly went back to just being darkness. I felt stressed about what to do next. I could stay and maybe get stuck in this place with all its scary stuff, or I could go and worry about the containment breaking without someone to take over. "What exactly would helping you entail?" I asked, still not committing. Jack's shoulders relaxed slightly. "For now, just knowledge. I'll teach you the history, the rituals, the true nature of what we're containing. Later, you'd participate in the maintenance of the boundaries." He pointed to the chalk circles. "This is just one of several anchors throughout the building. Each must be regularly reinforced." I took a deep breath. I need time to think about this. Of course, but not too long. Jack looked at the ritual space once more. "The 10:30 boundary maintenance is due to begin soon. You should return upstairs before then." As I turned to leave, Jack added, "Tom, whatever you decide, do not tell the other employees what you've seen here." Knowledge. 2 nights after my encounter with Jack in the basement, I pulled into the warehouse parking lot for my evening shift. Something felt off right away. The building was dark against the night sky, not a single light on in any window. The usual outside lights were off with only the dim parking lot lights showing anything. I checked my watch, 8:17 p.m. I wasn't early or late. The warehouse should have been busy with the evening shift by now. As I got out of my car, Jack came, out from the shadows near the employee entrance. He stood there waiting, his face looking super pale in the weak parking lot lights. He looked stiff and nervous instead of his usual confident self. "It's happening," he said as I approached. No greeting, no explanation, just those two words. That sent a chill through me. "What's happening?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The containment. It's failing faster than I anticipated." Jack pulled a keycard from his pocket. "We need to go inside." I looked at the dark building, remembering Rule 9. Never enter the warehouse floor during a power outage. The power's out. This isn't a regular outage. Jack swiped his card at the reader. The door clicked open despite the lack of electricity. "They're testing the boundaries. Come with me now." Every instinct told me to get back in my car and drive away to keep the promise I'd made to Sarah Mitchell. But I followed Jack into the darkness, letting the heavy door swing shut behind us. Inside, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. My breath clouded in front of my face as Jack switched on a flashlight, breaking another of the warehouse rules. The light showed the empty reception area as we walked in. "The night shift?" I asked. "I sent everyone home when it started." Jack moved toward the hallway leading to the warehouse floor. Said it was an electrical issue that needed repair. As we entered the main warehouse, the flashlight beam caught something moving across the wall to our right. A shadow moving sideways even though nothing was there to make it. Another shadow moved across the floor, went through a support column, and kept going on the other side. "They're becoming more active," Jack said, his voice tight, more independent. I watched the shadows move around, testing boundaries, stretching into shapes that looked almost like people before fading away. "What changed? You said this was happening faster than you expected." Jack pointed his flashlight toward aisle 12, where I'd first seen the tall figure. "It's been building for months, years really, but there was a surge tonight." He looked at me. "I think they sense a potential change, a new keeper." We walked through the warehouse floor, Jack's flashlight lighting our way. I noticed it got colder as we passed certain areas. Near the east wing, my ears popped like the air pressure had suddenly changed. A soft whispering sound seemed to follow us, too quiet to make out any words. Jack led me to the hidden door by the loading dock. It opened when he touched it, showing the stairs going down into the dark. "The ritual space looks different," Jack warned as we started down the stairs. "It adapts to what's needed." The basement looked different since I'd last seen it. The single ritual circle had grown into 3 rings that covered most of the floor. Candles burned at certain points along each circle, making the room even colder than it already was. Strange. Symbols I didn't know were painted between the rings in what looked like red paint, or maybe something else. In the middle of the smallest circle was a stand I hadn't seen before. On it sat an old leather-bound book, like Raymond Cooper's journal, but bigger and more beat up. "This is the Keeper's text," Jack said, gesturing to the book. "It contains the history of this site, the nature of the entities, and the rituals needed to maintain the boundaries." Jack turned to face me directly. His eyes looked sunken, his skin pale in the candlelight. "There's a final rule I haven't shared. With you, the most important one." He took a deep breath.